There's a reason why I'm structuring this video as I'm doing. So we're going to go through each election basically in Quebec history from 1944 until today, and then briefly Welsh political history after. And I'm doing so because I want to show you the contrast. There's a point to this video, and you'll understand after I go through them. There's an important reason regarding my country, Wales, as why I'm showing you Quebec. What can my country, Wales, learn from Quebec? Both of these countries are surrounded by English, and yet Quebec is dynamic. This is Benjamin, and I want to give you what I think is a great lesson for we in Wales to learn from Quebec. Let's go. So a bit about these political parties. I'm going to show you these logos here. Now, the logos of these parties have changed over time, but I'm not going to go through and show you the changes in their logos. I'm just going to give you one logo for the whole time, right? Just to simplify it. I don't want to confuse people. That's about it, so let's get started. Quebec, 1944. The World War was raging. A man came to power, Duplessis, who would reign for the next 16 years. And his party was a Union Nationale. I need to mention this earlier on, for later you'll see. They emerged out of a merger of different conservative groups. And the Canadian Tories, the Canadian Conservative Party, was kind of broken off from, and you'll see why I mention that for later. Union Nationale. This is conservative, deeply attached to the church, and quite corrupt in people giving backroom deals. His personality was populist. And yes, whilst it was nationalist, it wasn't directly nationalist in the way we think of nationalism today. And that's important, because nationalism in Quebec was going to radically change. And I need to just go quickly into a bit about who this Maurice Duplessis is or was, because he's that important. He shaped Quebec so deeply that there was going to eventually be a revolution against him, against everything that he stood for. So the slogan that he liked to use was, "Le ciel est bleu, l'enfer est rouge." The sky is blue, hell is red. This is many meanings here. He was so attached to the Catholic Church that that was his base of power in Quebec. But blue, the color of Quebec and Union Nationale. And red, the color of the Canadian Liberal Party, basically the party of status quo in Canada at the time, or Quebec rather. And he was pitting himself against this, a dichotomy, us and them. It was very divisive, but it was also an insult, a slant toward saying communism, don't fall for this kind of thing. He was staunchly against nationalization of any kind and using the church. He controlled healthcare and education through the Church of Quebec. Now society was changing. It was beginning to further industrialize and urbanize, undermining the support. But look at these elections here. He won with 48 seats in 1944, but then in the next election, 1948, he skyrocketed up to 82 seats. The opposition only gaining 8 seats. You can see his grip on Quebec was firm by this point. And going into the 50s, he was still winning 68 seats. He won a 4th term, unprecedented before or since in Quebec. 72 seats for Union Nationale. This right-wing populist party controlled the country. And looking back afterwards, people from a different era, after the revolution that was coming, they called it La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness. Now that was biased, because the future that was coming saw this as a dark period in their history. They wanted to bring Quebec out into the light from this. A reaction was building already underneath, but it was very slowly coming, and it was concentrated in this Liberal Party, which was not Quebec nationalist, ironically, but in these social democratic values it had. But seeing Quebec nationalism existed, it began to shift toward Quebecois identity, much as the Labour Party has today. There's some freaky parallels there between Labour post-devolution in Wales and the Liberal Party of the early 1960s in Quebec. I need to mention another contrast with Wales is that this Duplessis was quite anti-Zionist. He used it against his enemies, speaking of an international Zionist brotherhood, making hook-nosed anti-Jewish references. And this logo here, it doesn't seem much of a coincidence to me that it's quite authoritarian looking, this UN bent. I'm not going to say it's a swastika-like thing, but it's very menacing, isn't it? Like, authority. I don't think that was unintentional. And it's interesting that in Wales, the anti-Semitism traditionally comes from the left. So that's a very significant contrast. But after 16 years and industry changing as well, people were going to change in a way that revolutionized Quebec in a way that never truly happened in Wales. 1960 is one of the two most important elections in the history of Quebec. The Liberal Party defeated this Union Nationale machine, bringing in a new era, but it's important because the leader, Lesage, was openly stating that he was going to change things at a values level. And they ushered in what's called the Quiet Revolution, a time of intense political and social change. The clergy holding on to the education and health care, this was gradually taken away from them and put more into the hands of the state. Hydroelectric schemes were created across Quebec. This nationalization of water is important because in the case of Wales, we would have avoided the whole Tryweryn incident where we had a village drowned out by authorities in England with no say over our own water resources. Quebec avoided any such thing because they controlled it after this quiet revolution. And this is important because this poster here, Maître chez nous, meaning masters in our place. Before this, the allophones, or English-speaking peoples, they had controlled the resources of Quebec. But Lesage and his quiet revolution, along with others, took this out of their hands, putting it in the hands of the state, controlled by the province of Quebec, meaning that Francophones were increasingly in charge of their own resources, and upper educational institutions were flipping to French. Positions of prestige after many, many decades of decline. French surged back. It was a revolution in culture and the ideas of the state's relation to the people. But ironically, the fact that Lesage, very pro-Canadian, helped usher in this revolution, it was going to lead to his demise and the demise of pro-Canadian sentiments in many parts, because it meant that Quebecois nationalism was going to change. And it became a shift towards social democratic values like we saw with Plaid Cymru, actually. But it was more revolutionary than what happened within Plaid Cymru in Wales, because it was not a reaction against Canadian Toryism, as it was in Plaid Cymru with English Toryism. No, this was a reaction against its own values, a revolution against its own self that spurred this social democratic revolution in Quebec. And that's important because we in Wales have not truly had a revolution against ourselves, like healthy nations sometimes do. Going into the 1960s, this Liberal Party is dominant, but 1966, by this time something new has happened in the social fabric of Quebec, because you have a new underground kind of answering to this revolution, and that's Québécois nationalism. They're not winning seats, but you have the RIN, Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, independentists from a non-culturally or socially conservative swing, which is completely new. And they take votes away from the Liberal Party, which is traditionally, it's a quite centrist party at this time, but it is left-wing in a lot of values. And this enables Union Nationale in 1966 to come back. Now, this is the last time that Union Nationale is able to obtain a victory. That's key to understand, because you have these underground bubblings up of a new type of Quebecois nationalism. And it's not from this Catholic, hyper-traditionalist view, because younger Quebec nationalists are shifting to a new idea of this social democracy. And in 1970, you get this new party coming up, winning 7 seats, Parti Québécois. They are, I would say, Quebec's answer to Plaid Cymru. And it's crucial to understand that, because they're not going to dominate forever in the nationalist scene like Plaid Cymru has in Wales. But this Liberal Party in Quebec, which is very much like the Labour Party in Wales, they're still going to hang around, and that's key to understand. One thing that I need to mention is the voting threshold. In Wales, we never really get above 45% of people even bothering to vote. In Quebec, for much of their history, it's been even above 80%. Not as much recently, but it's still around 70%. This changes their politics and how they view themselves. Why do we care so little about our own country's politics? An important thing to note is we're in 1970 here, that violent extremism in Wales and Quebec took different forms. We explicitly have Marxists here in Quebec killing people. And in Wales, you have people with semi-right-wing sentiments suggesting violence. And that's interesting that the crazy Marxists in Quebec are the ones that people see as genuinely evil. Because you have something called the October Crisis in Quebec, where this group, this armed group of Marxists, Le Front de Libération du Québec, kidnapped the provincial Labour minister Pierre Laporte and British diplomat James Cross. Laporte was killed, and the leader of Quebec at the time, Robert Bourassa, his management of it would grant him fame and standing. But this shocked Quebec, and the Premier of Quebec, Robert Bourassa, and the Mayor of Montreal at the time, Jean Drapeau, supported Trudeau, the Prime Minister at the time. They supported Trudeau's bringing in the War Measures Act, which limited civil liberties and granted the police far-reaching powers, allowing them to arrest and detain 497 people. this was a military lockdown across Quebec, basically, to get rid of this violent group that was preparing an armed insurgency against the Canadian state. And this Robert Bourassa was celebrated for his actions by many. In the next election, you see the number of seats Parti Québécois gained go down by 1, but the percentage of its vote went up a bit. And this is catastrophic for Union Nationale. The Liberal Party gains an astounding amount of seats there. And you have Créditis, which is, there's a financial background with industrialized rights, the unions and workers and stuff going on in Quebec in the background at this time. And this Robert Bourassa was celebrated by his actions by many, and the nationalism of Quebec seen as bad. And so the Liberal government in the next election, a landslide victory. 102 Liberal seats to just 6 Québécois and 2 of the Créditistes. The Union Nationale was gone, but not entirely yet. But this was the early 70s, and the gold standard around the world was changing, and there were economic issues with petrol and such. And so in the next election, people wanted a change. You see, this is a difference again between Quebec and Wales. When things didn't work out economically, the people of Quebec simply voted out the party in power and chose someone else. In Wales, when things didn't work out economically, we just voted for the same party. And in 1976, with this economic resentment bubbling up, the Parti Québécois won an election outright, gaining 76 seats, the first truly nationalist government clawing for independence. I mean, the Union Nationale had suggested it in the past, but it's not anything that it wasn't independentist, it was sovereignist. Do you understand the difference? It wanted powers gradually accumulated and protected. But this Parti Québécois was more on the offensive for independence. Now at the time, Plaid Company in Wales made gains, but it was nothing on this level at all. We didn't even have devolution yet, but there were referendums coming in both of our countries. And Parti Québécois during this had promised a referendum on independence. Around the same time, Wales had a referendum on granting home rule or devolution. And just compare these two referenda to each other. It's mind-boggling how different we are in how we view giving ourselves responsibility. Quebec voted no to independence in 1980, 59.56% to 40.44%. That's not close, but it's not too far, is it really, if you think about it? But Wales, even voting for basic home rule, look how we voted. 79.74% against to 20.26% for. And this, in the two cases, was a reflection of the party which put forward the question in the first place, because there were these economic resentments going on with all these union strikes and economic fuel prices going up. So the Labour Party, this was a way for we in Wales to rebel against them without throwing them out because of this, I'm going to say, kind of lunatic loyalty, which doesn't make sense always, but that's what happened. In the case of Quebec, it was the party they had voted in to get rid of these economic troubles, which had presented the referendum. So there was a lot more openness to it. And despite this losing the referendum, Parti Québécois won the next election The Union Nationale was gone. 80 seats for the Social Democratic Nationalists of Quebecois, 42 for the not-so-Social Democratic Federalists of the Liberals. And this was the new status quo in Quebec. Liberals versus Parti Québécois. Two versions of the left. Remember when I said that the Canadian Tories essentially gave up ground to Union Nationale? And that was the conservative voice in Quebec. Well, when Union Nationale went, that meant that there was a vacuum on the right. There was no party, which meant that the Liberals shifted to the right, allowing Parti Québécois to take the predominant Social Democratic left, giving a new order to politics in Quebec. But this also had a long-term other effect. It left a vacuum on the right, and the Rebel Alliance became conservatives in Quebec, which meant over the next 2 decades, conservatives became the resistance in Quebec. But despite this defeat, Parti Québécois, before this referendum that they lost, had done something that has changed Quebec forever. And even the Anglophone of Canada will be looking at this probably centuries from now. 1977, Le Charte de la langue française. This was revolutionary, making French firmly the official language of Quebec. And I've made a brief video on this to go into this video. And part of that video is just, I'm going to read the preamble of this so you can understand how far-reaching this law was. That from now on, there was no question about what the cultural identity of Quebec is. French. They took ideas directly from France and pushed them into the fabric of Canada forever. And I'm going to read the preamble to this law 101, created by this man, Camille Laurent. Just listen to this and reflect on what it would mean for a society that speaks a different language to other provinces around it within the same nation state. It is revolutionary. Whereas the French language, the distinctive language of a people that is in the majority French-speaking, is the instrument by which that people has articulated its identity. Whereas the National Assembly of Quebec recognizes that Quebecers wish to see the quality and influence of French language assured, and is resolved therefore to make French the language of government and law, as well as the normal everyday language of work, instruction, communication, commerce, and business. Whereas the National Assembly recognizes that French is the only common language of the Quebec nation, and that it is essential that all be aware of the importance of the French language and Quebec culture as the elements that bind society together. And whereas it is resolved, therefore, to ensure that everyone has access to learning French and to perfecting knowledge and mastery of the language, and to make French the language of instruction. Whereas the National Assembly intends to pursue this objective in a spirit of fairness and open-mindedness, respectful of the institutions of the English-speaking community of Quebec, and respectful of ethnic minorities, whose valuable contribution to the development of Quebec it readily acknowledges. Whereas the National Assembly of Quebec recognizes the right of First Nations and the Inuit in Quebec, the first inhabitants of this land, to preserve their language and culture. Whereas Quebec is the only French-speaking state in North America and shares a long history with the Francophone and Acadian communities of Canada. And whereas that confers a special responsibility on Quebec, which intends to play a leading role within La Francophonie. Whereas these observations and intentions are in keeping with a new perception of the worth and national cultures in all parts of the earth, and of the obligation of every people to contribute in its special way to the international community. Whereas, in accordance with parliamentary sovereignty, it is incumbent on the Parliament of Quebec to confirm the status of French as the official language and common language in the territory of Quebec, and to enshrine in paramountcy of that status in Quebec's legal order, while ensuring a balance between the collective rights of the Quebec nation and human rights and freedoms. Therefore, Her Majesty, with the advice and consent of the National Assembly of Quebec, enacts as follows. And so with that Bill 101, they then attempted on the back of that victory to call for this referendum. And in my mind, they achieved the greater victory first. Their culture is safe. Robert Bourassa came back strongly in 1985. 99 Liberal seats. That's astounding. And he does it again. 92 in 1989. But in 1989, we're beginning to see some of the resentment to this Bill 101. Bourassa is still victorious, but you have this strange little party, Le Parti Égalitaire, calling for Anglophone rights in Quebec. 4 seats. It's really nothing more than an anti-French party under the label of bilingualism. And we get this in Wales. People calling for bilingualism, and what they really mean is they just want it in English. And you can see how far ahead of us they were even in the 80s. We had no concept of being able to even dream this at the time. We would see backlashes similar of this in the 2010s. People against devolution and the Welsh language, merely for having bilingual. But they were fighting for the right to have it monolingual in their own language, and they were winning. These Parti Égalitaire wanted to repeal Bill 101, essentially the stage that abolished the Welsh Assembly people are at now. And they wanted to tear down the statement that Quebec is a distinct society, which is in law a fact. So they were opposing French identity, but they were running scared. But the point is, there were undercurrents brewing, this monolith of liberals versus Parti Québécois. It was stable and seemingly permanent, but there was an underbelly. Another revolution was brewing just as one had brewed against Duplessis and Union Nationale. Robert Bourassa's liberal era was coming to an end, but it's noteworthy that part of this era coincided with the Reagan and Thatcher era, in that Canada had a conservative government on the federal level for a lot of this. Not all of it. But Quebec reacted against that into going left. But there were already signs of new currents brewing against this left-wing ideology in Quebec itself. And so in 1994, you have a new party emerge in Quebec in this election, Action Démocratique. It's center-right, it's fiscally conservative, it's pro-commerce, and it gains a seat in this election, in which Parti Québécois wins. The Liberals go under. Parti Québécois says, we're going to hold another referendum on independence. Here in Wales, not long after we're having our own referendum on getting home rule again, and the context of how these two clash is fascinating, because Quebec and Wales both make decisions within a hair's breadth of yes or no about their identity and cultural understanding of themselves. And Quebec narrowly votes no to independence. I mean, this would have split Canada in half. No, 50.58%. Yes, 49.42%. And in Wales, we voted yes by 50.30% to 49.70%. That is a tiny fraction. That's less than 55,000 people. Between Quebec splitting Canada in two and becoming a state, surrounded by thousands of miles of English, or staying part of this. And in Wales, we had a margin of fewer than 7,000 people choosing for some small level of home rule. I mean, if this had not gone through, I'm very sure that we would have just vanished as a people slowly into England. That's another story. In this case, we chose two different destinies, but the margin in these was responsibility. Quebec was voting for the responsibility of a state and all that goes with that. Duties, mistakes if you mess up, all of it. Wales, we were voting merely on the responsibility of acknowledging that we exist. And we barely even chose to acknowledge that we're even a country. Despite this loss, the Parti Québécois won the next election. And look at the Action Démocratique. They get one seat again, but it's their percentage that goes up. They've gone from getting 6.89% of the vote to well over 11% of the vote. Almost doubling their percentage. There's an underbelly coming. Quebecois society is changing. Parti Québécois begins to move more toward center ground, and the Action Démocratique is trying to avoid being seen as too right-wing. So they're both competing for the center ground, and this makes them easy prey for the Liberal Party, who wins the next election in 2003. But Action Démocratique gains ground, notably so, 4 seats this time. For the first time since Union Nationale, a non-left-wing Quebecois nationalist voice is pronouncing itself as having its own vision, an alternative to Parti Québécois, an alternative even on the range of ethos to the Liberal Party. In Wales in this period, we had no such thing. No such revolution and thought had taken place. This man, Jean Charest, he carries them on to victory again in 2007. Only a year after 2007's election, you had the economic crash of 2008. And Jean Charest called an election in 2008 to respond to this, to see what people wanted, how they wanted their government to respond to the economic crash. It was a wise move because it crushed the Action Démocratique and their hard fiscal conservatism. Their votes plummeted. But the Liberals, they went down as well in the vote share. Parti Québécois went up, but it wasn't enough to overcome the Liberal majority. So a smart move of him calling an election at that time. But you had a new party, Québec Solidaire. And this, I guess the only word I could come up with to describe it would be progressivist, kind of latching on to these eco issues, these little identity niche issues, deconstructive policy, lack of clear hierarchy, kind of not anarchist, but and not quite neo-Marxist. Just you see a flash of this happen over here in Wales a bit later, but we don't get a new party out of it like Quebec does. So new ideas are emerging out of this economic crash. People are wanting a new way of doing things, and it changes Quebec politics in a way that we don't see in Wales. Now, we almost have what's called a rainbow coalition to remove the Labour Party, but it doesn't come to fruition. So our politics in this era does not change whilst in Quebec. It clearly has a ground shift happening. Leading up to the next election, the Liberals cannot use the economy to win votes. They begin turning toward these kind of diversity issues and immigration, bringing people in. And this causes things to develop in Quebec in a new way. The Parti Québécois can react to this, saying that they'll improve the economy. But the right can say that they'll improve the culture and bring back fiscal responsibility. And so Quebec revolts against the ideas of the economic crash period in a way that Wales just does not do. And the pro-Canadian group of the Liberals is using immigration to try to concentrate its vote, to push out this Quebec nationalism using people coming in to Quebec. It doesn't work, it backfires against the Liberal Party in Quebec. Parti Québécois win the next election with 54, and the former Action Démocratique merges with other groups to form Coalition Avenir Québec, a new pro-business, socially conservative, centre-right party. This is revolutionary. It's not been seen this kind of thing since the days of Union Nationale, but this is in a new way. It's moderate in terms of its constitutional ideas, so people who are against Quebecois independence are included, and people who are for are included. It's the economic base and the cultural base that concerns them most. It's a revolution. And Pauline Marois, the first female the first female premier of Quebec. That's significant. Good job. And Quebec Solidaire is still here. It grows, actually, which is not usually what happens with a flash-in-the-pan leftist party. It advances because of the ground shift that is happening. And in the next election, the nationalist vote splits in a way that it's not since the 1970s. Parti Québécois plummets to 30 seats, but CAQ, Coalition Avenir Québec, surges up. 22 seats in Quebec Solidaire, 3 seats. So what's happening here is you have 3 different visions of Quebec from the non-Canadian view and the traditional view, which is the social democratic independence, is losing ground to these new ideas. We've never had anything like this in Wales. We still live in the social democratic status quo of the 20th century. But because of this, the Liberal Party in Quebec wins. It's interesting that CAQ is led by a businessman, Francois Legault, and not a solicitor or a man of the legal profession, as is traditionally had in these political groups. Things are changing. In the next election, we have the first centre-right Quebec government since the days of Union Nationale. 1966. 52 years without a centre-right government, and then it comes in. That's That's astounding. Quebec has changed its political ideas, and the traditional party of Quebec nationalism, Parti Québécois, plummets to 10, tied with Quebec Solidaire. There's a battle going on now for who's going to represent the left-wing ideas of Quebec nationalism. And look at the percentage. 17.6% for Parti Québécois and 16.10% for Quebec Solidaire. The party which brought Quebec to the brink of independence twice is now almost the last ranked party. Remarkable. But things get more drastic in the shift that's coming through. CAQ gets up to 90 seats. 90 seats. A new status quo is emerging. They are the party who's challenging the liberal pro-Canadian voice. They're the party saying that they're going to manage the affairs of the economy, but not in a socially democratic way, as is the tradition. There's been a revolution in thought. Pro-capitalist, pro-family, pro-market. 3 seats is pathetic. I mean, don't get me wrong, at least you got in, but Quebec Solidaire are at 11 seats. The left is now a new voice. Will it continue? We don't know. But the point is that the status quo, that period of Parti Québécois or Liberal Party, much like in our country that the status quo has been Plaid Cymru Labour since devolution. We have not changed, but Quebec has had the courage to change its ideas and move on from such things. Now what about Wales? Wales, on the other hand, just look. Now do you see what I'm speaking of in this video? Our social life, our political life, our civic space, especially our economics and cultural rights in that growth, have stagnated relatively over the last 3 generations because we have not had the courage to change politics. Our politics are defined against whatever England is. That's not what a nation is. A nation revolts against its own ideas. It changes in reference to itself, not in reference to another nation. And yes, we have had the social democratic revolution of the post-war era, but we have not yet had a revolution against the values of the post-war era as Quebec has had. And that's deeply unhealthy that we're still in the same values system as we were in the mid-early 60s, when Quebec had a plethora of nationalist voices erupting. We had one leader in Plaid Cymru, Gwynfor Evans, for 31 years, and one nationalist party. And it's frustrating because I care about the Welsh nation. And my message for making this video is, look at Quebec. They've had the audacity to rebel against their own ideas. It's not Canada is an enemy and we are the good. No. Le Grand Noirceur, the Great Darkness, they've rebelled against themselves, and now with Coalition Avenir Quebec, they've changed their values in relation to themselves again, at least in political sense. And we never have. And when I look around at the lack of financial opportunity in Wales and the state of our language, Riaith Gymraeg, I think a lot of it stems from this stagnation politically in one narrow left social democratic part of the spectrum, when the spectrum of politics in each nation is a rainbow. I hope someone out there hears me. There are voices picking up through the soil in Welsh, but they're small and scattered. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wylio. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time, and here are my Patreons on the screen now. Thank you for your kind contribution. It helps carry us forward.